Hello, beautiful people. Um, Thank you for coming. Welcome to Accessibility in UX Design with me, Isabel from Major League Hacking. And yeah, to those who are unfamiliar, my name is Isa or Isabel. I'm a coach here at Major League Hacking. I use she, her pronouns. And a fun fact about me is that I've seen a lot of anime. If you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with me. The link is up there. But today, or right now specifically, I will be talking about accessibility within user experience design. Um, Hi friends. I see people in the chat. I would love to hear from y'all. Thank you. I like to have my workshops interactive or I like to pause for questions and stuff like that. I should get rid of that. Awesome. Cool. So, um, when I'm talking about accessibility within user experience design, people usually think it's just for people with disabilities, but that is not the case. First of all, there are a lot of different ways that someone can have a disability. This could be in terms of vision or hearing or mobility or speaking, or it can even be cognitive limitations or intellectual disabilities. Think about dyslexia or things of that nature. And then if you see on the image on the right hand side, we have um, there are permanent disabilities, and then there are temporary and even situational disabilities that affect someone's ability to use a product that you're using. Some things that I learned about accessibility outside of user experience design could be, for example, um, when I entered for Microsoft, they did this really cool thing where during Zoom calls, or in this case, Microsoft Team calls, they would describe, okay, I am a um, pink haired Asian woman with a red shirt and glasses, which helps people who are visually impaired to still be able to keep up with the stream, etc. And like visualize what is going on in their own way. If that is something that you need, or for example, you need closed captions in order to better understand what I'm saying, I sometimes need that when people have accents. I don't know if I probably have one, but those are some ways that accessibility is available outside of user experience design. I think most of the points that I'm gonna give for this workshop are in terms of, for example, website or mobile design. Um, but accessibility extends to more than that. And I would love to talk about ways you can allow accessibility in other ways as well. So, yeah, that was a ramble. My bad. One such way, okay. There is an organization or a protocol called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are the ways that they break down accessibility. Is it perceivable? Is it operable? Is it understandable? And is it robust? What this means is, can the content be consumed in different ways? One way we're talking about this is, can I listen to it and look at it at the same time? So some folks, when they listen to my workshops, they put me on one side of the monitor and then just listen to me and then do their own thing. That is still kind of accessibility because it allows them to not have to look, but still receive the information, or consume the content in this case, to make it more general. There is also operability. Can it function without confusion and without the use of a mouse with complex interactions? Um, this isn't the case. For example, I mentioned earlier mobility issues. So if someone can't move their hands or can only move them in a certain way, can that content still be consumed by that person? Then we have understandable. Can the user understand how the user interface of the site functions and the information on the site? Um, some concepts within user experience design in general, and like not talking about accessibility, is, for example, iconography is the first thing that comes to mind. We know that an icon of a house is the homepage. We know that cogs are the settings page, and that is one way that that is accessibility can go into that by making sure that the stuff that you're putting on your website is understandable regardless of, for example, their grasp of the English language. Oh, I'll pause for a question. Is responsiveness accessibility? Yes, definitely, for sure. So we could, from, for example, a web designer's perspective, it could just be, can the text be readable in a smaller screen and the pictures not be janky and hidden? But more so than that, which I'll go into more later, um, responsiveness making sure that your website is responsive allows for example, there are folks who can't use a desktop or can't use a full-sized screen, and therefore they need to make it accessible. You as a designer would want to make it accessible to that audience as well, by making the designs work in smaller screens. Or I'll also be talking about text sizes, etc. So yeah, definitely, short answer is yes. um, and finally, on the WCAG principles, the last one is robustness. Can different assistive devices understand the website? Screen readers is one good example of an assistive device. To those who are unfamiliar, screen readers are the things that read the text for you. And this includes, for example, the images that are there. And I will gladly talk about alt text in one of my future slides, but that is one way that you can increase the robustness or the working with assistive devices ness of your website. My words are missing me. My bad. But if you have any questions, or if you want me to repeat something in a different way, feel free to put it in the chat. I would love to also be accessible in my accessibility workshop. So I'm going to start with text. As I mentioned, the power of alt text is super powerful. Alt text is the label that describes the relevant images on a screen so that screen readers can say what's in an image to someone that's visually impaired or blind. One point to note here is that, oh, okay, so for example, to make this geared towards our beginners in the audience, you know, when you do your HTML tags and you say image source, and then most linters will ask you to include alt text. So this is, I guess, DevTools' way of improving accessibility with the alt text. You're asked to describe the image that you're putting on your website. It could be as simple as like, okay, this is a person, or you could be more descriptive, and this is a person with red hair, and this is a person with glasses, etc. One thing to note would be, if it's just designs, you don't have to describe it. You don't, like, those are instances where you might not want to put alt text. For example, in my slides, I have a design on the top that's 3 colors: red, then blue, then yellow, which is the logo, which is the color scheme of Major League Hacking. If you might think that that might also need alt text. However, since it's just a design and not like an image that has content, like an infographic or a graph, describing it would distract from the content of your website. So you don't have to put alt text for stuff like that. But for example, I'll skip a little bit. Oops, wrong one. I'll skip a little bit. These kinds of images would in turn require alt text, because someone who is visually impaired who needs a screen reader might not be able to receive that information, receive that content otherwise. Another thing that is useful with alt text is searchable. So if you want to Google something, search queries are more will be able to include that image that has the alt text because of the alt text. So searching would be better with alt text. Yes. Awesome. So another point that I'd like to make is transcriptions and closed captions. So if you have a video, for example, if it's something that, so transcriptions are when the words that are uttered in the video are transcribed in like paragraph form that you can read all at once, like a paragraph or an article. That's one way that you can make it textually accessible to people. And another way is closed captions. Closed captions are live transcriptions where it's on the screen as the person is talking. Um, Dang, I would love it if like that was something that StreamYard was able to do. Like on my stream, like if the subtitles, or in this case closed captions, would be available at the bottom. But I guess that's something for another time. If someone wants to make a hackathon project of that, that'd be cool. So closed captions, live subtitles on a video, and then transcriptions is all of those subtitles put together in a paragraph or in like a readable format. Another way that would make your designs accessible is having narrow widths for readability. Um, the reasoning for that is if you have a big screen, for example, for me with my monitor right here, I'd have to move my head around like that to be able to read everything if the text blocks aren't narrow. Ways that can't be oh, okay, so text TTS is text to screen, I think. Let me TTS is text to screen. Text to speech, sorry, text to speech, yes. So text to speech is like the technology in general, and then using TTS for accessibility would be the transcriptions and closed captions, if that makes sense. So TTS is just the tech itself, and then the use case would be transcriptions and closed captions. So I probably need a drink. I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second. Sorry for the break, friends. I didn't want y'all to see me drink straight from the bottle of like milk. But so if the text blocks are wide, then the user, if they have a big screen, would have to tilt their head, which might not be easy for folks with mobility issues. Or they'd have to move their eyes, which some people still have trouble with. Even for people without mobility issues, it's generally easier for folks to read if, honestly, I should be learning from my own message. It would be like this. And then I guess this is a live example of how you would want to make your designs more accessible. So I had tried to explain that narrow widths are easier to read, so I'm making it narrower, but then it goes past. So I would want to lower the font size, but then there's a limit to how small you want your text to be, so that people won't have to manually zoom in order to read your text. So another way that you can adjust that, which I'll go into specifics in the next slide, is line height, or like how far apart they are, each line is from each other. That's a little better. Yeah. So I'll call it that, and then users should be able to zoom into your site 200% without having to scroll horizontally. Let's see if I zoom this 200%. Oh, not it. Nope. Okay, so it's still readable. I check the boxes. But the reason for that is some folks, even if they won't be, so for example, in order to adapt to um, a website that has small font, they'd have to zoom in or use a screen reader. If they're not comfortable listening or they don't want to listen, then they would have to zoom in. And if you zoom in with and you have to scroll horizontally and vertically, there's a whole bunch of issues that are brought up with that. Finally, with regards to text in general, try to avoid links that say click here or more details. Instead, what I've been doing is, so in our resources link, if you actually put, so for example, if I copy this link and you paste it, Google Slides and a bunch of other platforms are in their attempt to become more accessible, have done this thing where if you click on it, if you let me move this higher up. That's an accessibility issue that they're going to have to fix eventually. Um, you can click on it and say replace URL with its title. Therefore, any screen reader would be able to read accessibility in UX as opposed to HTTPS blah. So that's another way to make your website more accessible for folks with screen readers and other like assistive tech. Sorry. Cool. So that's it for text. Unless anyone has any questions, I'll move on to typography. Here we have specific like minimum requirements that would make text more readable. So line height. So what I mentioned was how tall the space is between letters. So the gap from here to here is line height. Letter spacing is the gap from L to E. And then word spacing is like just the space bar. Spacing following paragraphs would be between each bullet point as opposed to between each line within the bullet point. This allows, so for to see this in action, so for example, if I change this line height to single, which is usually what we do for like on paper when we used to, I don't know if you still print out like papers for English class, they would ask for single space. So it gets clunky when you have a lot of text and would make it hard to read in general. Whereas if we change it to 1.15 is a little bit better, but it's saying here that it should be 1.5 times the font size. My font size is 16, so this should be good, but there, 1.5. That is the like the minimum requirement in order for something to be considered accessible. If you're wondering, like if you by any chance are wondering why else would you care about typography or accessibility aside from wanting to involve other people that don't have the same ability as you, it would also be helpful for SEO. SEO is improved when your website is accessible. If it's not very readable or if the design is wonky, etc., etc., that gets factored into search query ranking. So that's something worth noting as well. And another point in typography is letter spacing should be 0.12 times the font size, 0.16 times the font size for word spacing. And then finally, font sizes should not be smaller than 10 points. What that would look like. So anything this or smaller is too small for, according to the WCAG. Sorry, my bad. But yeah. So we've got that for typography. Next up, I'm going to go into color. So there are folks who are colorblind or have trouble differentiating color. If you see, you've probably seen those images like these before that check whether you're colorblind or not, and they just have a number in the middle or something in the middle that you can't, that other folks won't be able to tell. So there might be someone in the audience right now who can't see that this is a number 29. I think it's like red-green colorblindness, this particular color combination. And what's basically happening is people can't, those folks won't be able to tell the difference between this red and this green, even though to someone who is able-bodied, it would be super duper obvious. With that in mind, with colorblindness in mind, you would want to convey information in more than just color. So one example of this is for the screenshots on the upper left-hand side, we have PayPal's sign-up form, which if someone is colorblind, which is the grayscale image on the left, you wouldn't be able to tell immediately, if at all, that there are errors in those fields, because all that we see is a red outline. That's usually the case. I've been I've fallen victim to this as well, where my design was like, oh, I'm gonna be sleek and stylish and modern and minimalist, and just put an outline on the field that says it's an error. While that does make it streamlined and easier, you don't include the folks who will not be able to see that color, who need more of a visual cue to understand certain things. So, an alternative to just having color as your way of conveying information, you could also make the border thicker. You could include icons. So, that's something that's here. In our screenshot, there's a warning icon, but we only see that in the CAPTCHA code, which CAPTCHA is another point of contention with accessibility, because if you're asking for someone to read an image to prove that they're human, what if they can't either read or read images? So that's something that's worth. Oh, and then the accessibility alternative for that is, I see here now as I say it out loud, there's a button that reads the text for you. I Last time I tried that, like tried clicking that button, it was like robotic and gargly. I don't know if they've improved that since. I should probably check that out. If someone knows, let me know in the chat. Um, but oh, going back, so adding icons, as I mentioned, reading the image out loud, having bold text, underlines, italics, etc., would still convey the information, but it wouldn't just be color conveying that information. So if someone can't understand one cue, they can use another cue. So adding labels to color selectors or adding icons to error messages are ways to improve accessibility in your designs. Moreover, sufficient contrast between text and backgrounds helps with readability. So if you have something, for example, like if I change the contrast between this text and this background, for example, by changing the color to this. So even as a non-colorblind person, I'm already having a bit of trouble reading this. Even more so if you're colorblind, and let's say if it's not the text color that's a little wonky, it might be, where am I going? There we go. It might be the background. Ooh, that's not that bad. There, that's a little worse. So this is another way that contrast is not excuse me. This might be another way that contrast is getting in the way of readability. Here, it like the a glass for my milk. Sorry. Um, so here we see that changing the text color was worse than changing the background color. And one reason for that is because, as we said in typography, I think I mentioned in typography, like how thick text should be. So there are some fonts, for example, this looks thin. So this is super duper skinny, which is pretty hard to read. If you can't if you can't tell just by reading this part that it's hard to read, in comparison to this, it's definitely harder to read. So choosing your fonts wisely is another way that you can improve readability. Let's bring this back to the right color. Reset. Wee, cool, nice, awesome. So that's it for color, unless anyone has any questions. I seem to be breezing through this. So if you're curious about anything, or if you want me to add anything, please feel free to let me know. That is way too small. I should probably add that in a different slide by itself. So there, making it bigger so that it's readable to everyone in the audience. Whee! Cool. And then we have it. Whee, there. Nice. So as I was saying, we're going into navigation and flow. One thing that has personally bothered me a little bit with website design is hovering. So if you have to hover, for example, let's see, there are like tooltips when you hover sometimes. Yeah, see there. So hovering excludes keyboard only interactions. Um, because, for example, in order for me to know that Start Slideshow's keyboard shortcut is Control plus F5, I had to hover over this button. I don't see anywhere. Let's see if I can keyboard. Oopsies. If I try keyboard navigations right now, so I'm trying to do it. It's not letting me get there. Um, nope. Yeah, so I don't have any way to find that information without having to hover. So that excludes an entire population of people who can't use the mouse. Um, so allowing for whatever information you're putting on the hover, whatever design you're putting on the hover, to still be accessible even without hovering is super duper important. Um, what alternatives can so there are some hovering where like they just zoom in a little bit when you hover. That's kind of okay. But if, for example, like this example that I'm showing you right now, where there's information on the hover, make sure that that information is accessible even without hovering. And then don't forget to include a back button in each page or step, especially if you have, for example, a form. I'll go into that in another slide. But if you have a form or any other thing that requires multiple steps, and there's no way for you to get to the previous step without starting from the beginning, that is a problem in accessibility. Because not yeah, I feel like I'm starting to ramble about the reasons why things are not accessible. So I'm just going to straight up just say these are not accessible. Cool. So don't forget to include a back button within each step. When we make our website, sometimes we have to do that manually and we forget to do that, to include a back button in all of our pages. Um, so that's pretty important. Cool. Another thing worth noting for navigation and flow is ensuring that repeated components occur in the same order on each page of a site. So in this case, it would be our navigation bar, our bookmarks, and our extensions, etc. Those repeated components should remain the same whenever possible. Um, if all of a sudden, if I go to this slide and then background and layout are switched out, it would confuse our readers. It would, I just said don't like repeatedly explain. Oops. But yeah. So same order in each page, super duper important. And now going briefly into responsive design and simpler layout. I remember someone was asking about that in the chat, and that is important because let's see, mobile. If we want to turn this into, let's say that, already I am seeing that it has become much less accessible. Um, if if we were to make this design more accessible, maybe we could, for example, remove this sidebar and focus more on the content, and then just allow the sidebar to show up whenever possible. Um, Making these icons bigger, because if I understand correctly, the circleness of this cursor is about how big our finger is when it touches the screen. So if this is how big my thumb is and that's how tiny the button is, I'm going to be clicking on something beside the thing I'm actually trying to click on. It's going to be a little itsy bitsy difficult to understand. Oh, maybe if I turn this into 100, nope. See? So if I try to zoom it in to 150, it becomes a little easier to read through, to click through the buttons. So I guess that's a little okay. 200 makes it a little easier, yeah. But then now that I'm at 200, I am noticing that I can't get to the bottom anymore where I was able to hide the sidebar. So now I can't bring the sidebar back. So, and when I scroll down with my mouse, it changes the slides instead of brings me back to that part with the sidebar. So let's try zooming out again. Okay, there's my little thing. So if I were someone that had accessibility issues, did you see how many steps I had to go through just to do that? in order to be more inclusive of everyone, of all our users, we need to be cognizant of how they would go through this user experience. It's not just the able-bodied who see the entire screen exactly as we envision it, but also the folks who can't physically be able to experience the design the way we initially intended. And we have to make it so that they don't have to adapt. We can adapt for them, or we can make it adaptable for them. Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it. So I think that's it for responsive design and simpler layout. If I think something that would help if people still have questions about responsive design and simpler layout is if you have an example of a project that you have that you might not know how to make responsive, or you might not know how to make simpler, and then we can go through your design, and then we can kind of like go back and forth and brainstorm how that can be more, how we can edit it to be more accessible. So that's something that we could do. Or I could just like look for a bad example of accessibility online and go through that as a fine as like a wrap up. um, I included this screenshot of a website that so BetterHelp is for online therapy. Super duper recommend, but I don't think I'm supposed to like recommend stuff like that. But I liked that they had a section at the bottom of their page that was a link that like explained their accessibility accommodations. So how to enable accessibility on desktop, on the browser, and then they have separate pages for how accessibility could be done for mobile users, because phones have built-in accessibility features like you could zoom in, you have a magnifying glass, you have, as Wombo mentioned, text to speech, um, contrast, etc., built into mobile phones. But desktop browsers, not so much. So that's why they have the instructions here. Ad blockers may also interfere with accessibility, so they mentioned that. Oh, cool! They even mentioned like the WCAG that I was referring to earlier. So that's pretty cool. Just wanted to show an example of websites or companies or organizations that put their mouth where they're put their foot where they're, I don't know. There's an idiomatic expression that I'm looking for and failing to find that basically means they mean what they say. If they say they care about accessibility, this is proof that they care about accessibility instead of just saying fancy fluffy words. Um, Going into forms, here are some ways that for mouth where the money is. Thank you for that. Nice. Um, yes, cool. Awesome. Thank you. So for forms, a few ways that you can improve the accessibility of a form is by adding labels and placeholder inputs. Um, if you have, so the placeholder inputs are the text that goes into the box, like the gray part. So, so search Google or type a URL within this thing is the placeholder. When I click on it, it goes away. That would be difficult for someone, for example, who has the keyboard input and then they have to type along, and they wouldn't be able to read the text while they're typing along. So another way to help with that would be having the label on the side instead of inside the input. Help text or having instructions is also helpful. I don't know if I can pull up a good example of this fairly quickly, but some folks put very, very tiny font on the, I mean, very, very tiny font is also bad, but in this case, since it's only for folks who, it's specifically for folks who use screen readers, small text would still be read by a screen reader. So if you put tiny text that explains, okay, um, it has to be in the format, month, date, year when you input your birthday. That help text would be super duper helpful as opposed to someone trying to figure out do they use slashes or dots or dashes or whatever, or the actual letters in the word September. Um, Another way would be sensible grouping. So, for example, um, one way to group your forms is having them all, like if you do it the type form way, where it's like one question a page. That's sensible grouping, where like your personal information, like your name, birthday, etc., would be on one page, and then address would be on one page, and then whatever survey question you have is another page, would be sensible grouping. Another sensible grouping would be if you have if you have your form on just one page, putting spaces in between, like having buffers, either a thin horizontal bar. I know that Notion does this thing where like it's a very thin gray line. Yeah, thin gray. Exactly. Thank you so much. It understood me. So having these things to break up your form inputs allows for, like, logically you'll know which part you're on, and then it's also visually spacing out, for example, something that could be a very long form. So that's pretty cool. Again, I wanted to emphasize error messages should not be in color alone. We mentioned that in slide 8, so I'm not going to go into that again. CAPTCHA, I also briefly mentioned. It's accessible. It's highly controversial in the accessibility world. If you want to use it, provide text alternatives that can identify and describe its purpose. I want to like edit this a little bit and say, instead of just text alternatives, because remember when we were here, if you can't read it or if you can't see it, you can't use the CAPTCHA. So audio alternatives would also be super good. Text or audio alternatives that identify and describe its purpose. Super duper helpful. That way, um, I've encountered some instances where someone who has an accessibility issue and wants to create an account but can't because of the CAPTCHA have to go through the endeavor of finding the email address of that website, emailing tech support, getting them to get your account for you or find an alternative to the CAPTCHA, etc., etc., etc. Oops. But yeah, so CAPTCHAs, if you can avoid them, avoid them. Otherwise, I want to bring it back a little bit to a workshop that I had yesterday about using Google Cloud in your hackathon projects. I remember. So, Cloud, no, I think it was like Firebase has, Firebase authentication. And then I remember it was like, if you go to a phone number, reCAPTCHA verifier. Yeah. So there is an invisible reCAPTCHA which can verify the user without requiring any user action. So that's something pretty cool that technology has allowed to become available, but it's like not everyone is getting on the bandwagon on, because this, yeah. So that's one way that you can use how you can make CAPTCHAs more accessible. Awesome. So finally, with regards to forms, allow the users to review their form or their information before submitting. This is especially the case with either long forms or multi-page forms. So if you, for example, if you have a lot of information all at once, collating or compiling that into one final summary page before submitting, similar to how you have a warning before you place an order when you buy stuff, is, yeah, super duper helpful. Yeah, awesome. So review, confirm, and rectify information. That's something that I forgot to bring up. So there are there are websites that allow you to review and confirm your submissions, but it might also help to allow them to edit certain information or like parts of the information on that final page, where they don't have to go back to the previous page to fix the information, like a tiny little edit button, and then they can edit in line instead of going back to a previous page if that's the only thing that they need to edit in their submission. So that's something that is also pretty helpful. Um, and then I have two more things and then I'm good to go. For alternatives, so we had mentioned earlier about hover features not being accessible for folks without mice, or it's even for folks. Okay, it was in my head, but I didn't like find the words. If you have hover features, they won't show up on a phone. Yeah, because you can't hover with a touch. Yeah. So if you want hover features on your desktop website, you're gonna have to find another way to design it for your mobile site or for the mobile side of your website. Cool. Another thing worth noting is if you need device motion, like shake your phone to do a thing. This is difficult. So from a disability perspective, what if you can't shake your hand or whatever you're using to hold your device? And then on another end, even if you were disabled, what if you just didn't have a phone? Like that's something that's a little more relatable, I guess, for folks without disabilities, that makes them realize like, well, wait, accessibility is important. But yeah, so if you have a feature that needs to be activated through device motion, then provide a different interaction that allows the user to still get to that feature without moving their device, or allowing them to not enable the motion at all. Because, like, for example, I'm thinking of someone with Parkinson's or any other seizures, where someone might have trouble with movement. um, if they keep moving uncontrollably and that changes the website, then that would be a very frustrating experience that you might want to avoid. um, and that makes you lose users and or customers. So changing, either avoiding or adding on an alternative to device motion is super helpful. um, Another thing, which is what this image is, oh wow, okay, there. Another thing, which is what this image is about, is if you have complex gestures, then provide single points or alternatives. So we're probably familiar with having to pinch to zoom in and out on maps. That's super duper easy when you're on your phone, but it's fairly difficult when you're on a desktop or somewhere else that doesn't have a touch screen. And the alternative in this image that I have on the right hand side, which is a screenshot of Google Maps, is that they have a plus minus button for the zooming. That way, even if you can't use more than one touch point, you can still zoom in and out. Cool. And then finally, keyboard shortcuts. So there are some products that we have that have their own built-in keyboard shortcuts. Like, something that I learned recently that I probably shouldn't display on the screen is, if you have your website, if you have Gmail, then you can click R to reply to a message. But what if you accidentally click on R and that's a single point keyboard shortcut? Every time you click R, you might accidentally be replying to a text or an email. Allow either removing keyboard shortcuts or allowing for keyboard shortcuts to be edited, or making intuitive keyboard shortcuts, etc., are ways to make your website more, or product more accessible. Cool. Finally, this one was unrelated to everything else that I had, but I thought was super duper duper important too, because this one's life threatening. Don't use flashes. It causes seizures. People who have epilepsy or other photosensitive seizures will seize if you have flashing animations. So, as much as possible, avoid them. Or if you absolutely have to have a design or an animation, make sure it's either slow or doesn't flash or is small. And apparently red is worse. So don't include red. And then the flashes are of low contrast. So light blue and dark blue as opposed to black and white kind of contrast. Um, super duper important. That's why sometimes you might see on TikToks there's like trigger warnings or flash warnings. This is what that's for. If you have that on your website, please avoid it. People can seize. And yeah, I think those are the main points that I had for accessibility. I kind of breezed through that a little bit, but if you have any questions, concerns, things you want to add, things you want me to demonstrate, more than happy to do that. Yeah, cool. That's pretty quick. Oh, and if you're looking for the slides in case you want to review something or whatever, I have this. These slides are the first link on my link tree. The link tree that was in the announcement for this workshop, along with all the other slides and or videos I have available for previous workshops. Awesome. I guess that's it for me. Thank you everyone for staying tuned. I hope you learned a thing or two for making your projects more accessible. Bye, friends.